Welcome, Bellumnoxis Prime listeners! Legion, you march with me into fire and storm. Subscribe and join the Legion, for the night of battle has begun. The day rose hard and hot over Canaan, a white blade of sun drawn clean across the sky. Heat came early, not as a gentle warning, but as a command. Stand, march, endure! The wind was thin and tasted of chalk and salt. It carried the faint smell of the Orontes River and the older scent of baked clay, as if the earth itself had been fired in a kiln. On the far bank, like a fist raised from the plain, sat the Tell of Kadesh. Walls lifted upon layered ages. A city stacked on the bones of cities, its ramparts squared against the horizon. We marched in files that shimmered in the heat. The ground broke into powder beneath our sandals. Each step lifted a veil of dust that turned men to phantoms. Bronze edges flashed where sunlight found them. Sickle swords at hips, spearheads in fist. Shield rims nicked and blackened by older battles. Chariots rattled, their wheel spokes singing a dry, steady note like drumsticks on bone. Horses stamped and snorted, sweat forming a dark gloss along their necks. Leather stretched and creaked. Bowstrings thrummed low as archers tested them, the note a promise that arrows would fly before this sun found its rest. We were not one body but many, and that mattered. The Amun division with the Pharaoh himself, Ramesses, carved by rumor into a storm in mortal form, took the road nearest the river. To the south and lagging were the Ra, the Ptah farther yet, and the Set beyond them, a slow rolling ladder of men and wheels, strung out across the wilderness. The distance between divisions was more than measured in paces. It was measured in the time it would take for one heart to help another when iron began to sing. Some muttered about the gaps, others trusted the banners and the God King's shadow. Discipline won the argument on the surface. Under it, doubt sharpened like a whetstone across the mind. The scouts returned in twos and in threes, their cloaks stained with river mud and thorn scratch. They bowed low before the royal chariot and spoke of a scattered foe, Hittites dispersing, slow, unprepared. Their king Muwatalli far to the north. Their words were water in a hot throat. Easy victory, swift glory. The scribes scratched reeds across sheets of wet clay, catching the claims like flies in resin. Standard bearers leaned forward with quiet pride. Men laughed again, a little too loud, and the harness bells on the chariots chimed as if celebrating. But the land itself offered another counsel. Birds lifted from the valleys beyond Kadesh in sudden flurries, pouring upward as if shaken from a net. The dust hung strangely heavy near the city's rear, not the drift of idle wind, but the kind of haze made by many hooves, waiting without moving. Somewhere a jackal called at noon, a thing it should not do, and the call ran along the spine like a cold finger drawn from neck to shoulder. We turned off the road into ground packed hard as baked pottery. The river sounded close, a rush under the heat, and men tilted their helmets to catch a breath of it. Water parties filled amphorae and leather skins, and the taste of the river, green, metallic, cut through the dust. Scribes recited the roll, squadrons present, supply carts accounted. The smiths moved among us with small hammers and bags of rivets, tapping loose plates tight, trimming binding straps, fixing a chariot's axle that complained in a high, unhappy note. Fletchers checked feathers, smoothing them with wet fingers, aligning vein to vein. The priests passed, linen pure, skin oiled, swinging censers that wrote slow spirals of resin smoke into the air. They touched amulets, kissed the god figures riveted to shield bosses, and pressed a thumb of ash onto foreheads, leaving a gray crescent just beneath the helmet rim. Horses rolled their eyes at the incense and stamped, stamping small rhythms that matched the beating of our own hearts. The Pharaoh's chariot stood like a standard in flesh. The yoke gleamed. The reins were wrapped in red-dyed leather. The bow case leaned at just the right angle for a swift draw. Ramesses held the reins loose and easy, as if every axletree on the field were already in his hands. From time to time, he looked not at Kadesh, but at the distance between divisions, measuring the march with a commander's eye that sees the invisible. Time, reach, support. His guard clustered in a disciplined crescent, shields forward, javelins balanced to throw, eyes scanning the flat light for movement that did not belong. As the sun climbed, our shadows shortened and withdrew to our feet, making us look like men nailed in place. The ground gave up its trapped heat. Armor plates warmed against the chest. Sweat collected on the brow and under the collarbone, running in private rivers into the cotton of the tunic. Salt stung the eyes. The taste of the coming battle sat on the tongue the way iron does when you bite it. A sharp penny tang that refuses to leave. A drummer somewhere set a slow cadence. Pack animals shifted their weight and sighed. Near midday, a hush fell, the kind that rolls out from an unseen center, subtle and total. It was not silence. It was the smothering of small sounds beneath a larger listening. A pair of scouts came in late, their faces drawn, and their horses lathered white at the chest. They spoke first to captains, and the captains tightened their mouths and sent them forward again. The words did not ripple like rumor. They sank like a stone into deep water, and vanished under official reports that were brighter, easier to repeat. Hittites far, said the easy words. Hittites waiting, said the buried ones. We made camp light, no stakes deep into earth, no trench, no long labor, just enough to feed the men and rest the feet, while the Pharaoh's council measured angles on tablets. Bread broken, dates shared, watered wine passed with caution, horses fed nose bags and threw their heads in quick, grateful jerks. Bowstrings were unseated and checked, then reseated. Spear sockets were tested with a twist and a pull. Whetstones rasped along edges until the metal took a quiet, purposeful bite from the world. And then the omens marched through our ranks, uninvited. A standard that would not sit straight no matter how the bearer set it. A single wheel rim that cracked a thin smile after the smith swore it was sound. A band of cloud that ghosted the sun. Not enough to cool us, but just enough to dim the day to a pale coin. Men tightened straps that did not need tightening. Veterans spat into the dust for luck. A drummer missed a beat and then found it again. A hitch that made heads lift. By late afternoon, the light took on that old bronze tone that deserts make when they want to look like they have always been at war. The river dulled to pewter. Kadesh sat like a drawn knuckle beyond, and behind it the land swelled. Valleys and groves that could hide whole storms of men and horse. Our files straightened. The Amun division closed with the Pharaoh's chariot. The Ra somewhere behind raised a fine glittering haze. The Ptah and Set were lines on the heat-shaken horizon. Messengers ran, their legs dust-caked, passing orders sealed with the king's sign. Forward! Hold! Close intervals! Send wood for the wheels! As evening threatened, the heat did not fall so much as lean back on its elbows. The priests returned and spoke words against deception. The officers spoke words against fear. The men spoke little. We checked our sandals again, our laces again, the little things you cannot afford to fail when bigger things may. A fly crawled along a shield boss, gold in the late light, and took to the air when the shield lifted. Kadesh did not speak. The wind did not rise. The river kept its own counsel, but somewhere out beyond the city, a whisper ran across the ground. The drag sigh of many wheels waiting in shadow. The restless stamping of horses that knew the measure of war before men admitted it. The scouts' easy assurances lay beside our rations like another kind of food. Chewed, swallowed, not believed, Night would not bring cool relief, it would bring decisions. The Pharaoh's banner hung steady. Our grips remembered the shape of our weapons. The air tasted like the inside of a bronze bell just before the strike. And so we stood on the eve of Kadesh. Hot day, hardening into a harder night. Our divisions stretched like a bowstring across the plain. Our faith taut inside our chests. Our fears whispering their own counsel. The land had given its omens. The river had marked the boundary. The city had kept its silence. At dawn, something would break. Legion, the sun had barely lifted above the plain when the march resumed. The air was still heavy, hot, and stale, as if the world itself held its breath. Ramesses, the living pharaoh, pushed forward with the Amun division near the Orontes, while the Ra trailed behind, their banners rising and falling in the shimmer of heat. Farther yet were the Ptah and Set, so distant their dust looked like mirages against the horizon. The army was stretched thin, Commander, like a bow drawn to its limit, and the string was about to snap. The scouts who had ridden ahead returned with their tongues twisted by deception. 2 Hittite riders, captured and dragged before Pharaoh, swore with cracked lips and trembling voices that King Muwatalli's host was far to the north, too scattered to be of threat. Ramesses, seeking glory, trusted the words. He ordered camp to be struck close to Kadesh itself, tents pitched and chariots unyoked, as if the fortress would fall by fear alone. But the gods do not reward pride without trial. Hidden beyond the walls of Kadesh, in valleys and groves thick with shadow, the storm had gathered. 3,000 Hittite chariots stood yoked, bronze gleaming under cloaks of dust, their spears stacked like forests, their horses restless and hungry for the charge. Muwatalli himself watched from a ridge, his banners snapping above him, waiting for the moment to unleash the tide. It came swift. The Ra division, weary from the march, approached Pharaoh's camp. The dust of their advance had not yet settled when the earth itself began to thunder. Wheels struck the plain. The sound rolled like storm clouds colliding, a growl that built into a roar. From behind Kadesh's walls and out of the hidden valleys surged the Hittite chariots, rows upon rows, cutting the horizon with bronze and wood. The Ra had no time. The storm hit them like lightning splitting a tree. Horses screamed as chariots crashed into their flanks. Spears pierced men before they could raise shields, and dust swallowed the sky. Bronze-shod wheels crushed bone. Sand turned red in an instant. The Ra scattered, lines broken, officers shouting orders that vanished under the thunder of hooves. Some fled toward the river, others toward Pharaoh's camp, dragging the chaos with them. The first cries reached the Amun camp as men were untying their sandals, and priests were pouring libations. They turned to see their brothers torn apart, the proud Ra shattered before their eyes. Panic struck like a knife. Could the mighty Egyptian host truly fall in its own pride? Ramesses mounted his chariot, his face hard as sunlit stone, and seized the reins. "Legion," he roared, "the storm has come! Stand with me!" His guard rallied, shields lifted, spears braced. But the trap had sprung, Commander. The Pharaoh's army was divided, his divisions scattered across miles, and before him thundered the largest chariot force the world had ever seen. The Hittite tide crashed forward, and the plain of Kadesh became a maelstrom of bronze and blood. Legion, hear me! The plain of Kadesh became a furnace where bronze, wood, horse, and man were melted into ruin. The Hittite storm did not fall in single lines. It came in waves. Their chariots surged forward 3 abreast, wheels iron-banded, axles shrieking, each cart packed with warriors. Driver, spearman, shield-bearer, horses foamed, eyes white with fire, their hooves hammering the ground until the earth itself quaked. The Ra division was swallowed first. Where once stood ranks and banners, there was only chaos. Shields splintered, spears snapped, bodies broken beneath wheels that rolled without mercy. The air thickened with dust until the sun turned to copper, and within that storm the cries of men twisted into something unearthly. Some Egyptians tried to rally, forming knots of resistance, but the chariots simply rolled over them, horses trampling, bronze spears striking down like lightning bolts. The tide struck the Amun camp next. Ramesses' men had moments to seize their shields, to raise their spears, before the dust cloud announced the thunder. And then, the storm arrived. The first line of Hittite chariots slammed into the camp, like a river bursting its banks. Tents collapsed, fires scattered embers into the sand, and supply carts splintered. The earth itself was churned into mud and blood. Men who had just broken bread found themselves broken beneath wheels. Arrows whistled from Egyptian bows, finding marks, but for every charioteer that fell, 10 more pressed forward. Ramesses himself rose like a flame against the storm. Driving his golden chariot, horses stretched to the limit, he cut into the enemy's surge. His bow sang, arrows streaking into chariot crews. Spears fell from his guards, shields locked around him. Pharaoh shouted, his voice louder than thunder. "Legion of Egypt, stand! We are not dust beneath their wheels. We are the storm that breaks storms." His cry tore through the panic, and the Amun rallied. Bronze shields braced, spears thrust forward, and the camp became a wall of defiance against the flood. Still, the battle was beyond any mortal reckoning. Over 5,000 chariots collided upon that plain, their wheels grinding against one another, horses screaming in terror, men falling in heaps of bronze and blood. Dust swallowed sight, the sun itself was gone, turned to a dull ember. The ground shook with every charge, every countercharge, until it seemed the world itself would split. Pharaoh fought not as a god aloof, but as a man pressed to ruin, his armor dented, his horses streaked with foam and blood. He drove again and again into the enemy, his guard holding close, cutting down Hittites that threatened to pierce the line. Yet each wave brought more, as if Muwatalli had emptied the earth of warriors. Then, when the storm seemed ready to break Egypt itself, the Nearin arrived. Allies from Amurru, long sworn to Egypt, their banners rose like dawn against the dark. Fresh men, fresh chariots, cutting into the Hittite flank with the fury of salvation. Their charge split the momentum, turned the tide. Hittite wheels crashed against them, horses tangled, spears broke, and the storm that had seemed endless faltered at last. The plain of Kadesh was no longer a place of men. It was a graveyard of chariots. Splintered wood lay in heaps, bronze twisted, horses collapsed in exhaustion or death. The air reeked of sweat, blood, dust, and fire. The cries of the dying rang over the battlefield, and the living fought on, half blind, half mad, driven only by survival. As the sun bled into dusk, neither side could claim the ground. Ramesses still stood, his guards still unbroken. Muwatalli's host, though battered, had not been destroyed. The storm of bronze had raged and consumed thousands, yet Kadesh itself remained. The chariots slowed, the dust settled, and silence, terrible, heavy silence, fell. Legion, when the dust at last thinned, the field of Kadesh lay broken beyond imagining. The sun bled down into the west, its light falling across a plain littered with the wreckage of men and beasts. Chariots lay shattered, axles snapped, wheels turned sideways, spokes jutting like ribs from a carcass. Horses, once thunder in motion, lay sprawled in silence, their harnesses twisted in the sand. Bronze weapons glimmered faintly in the dying light, scattered among the bodies of those who had wielded them. The cries of the wounded rose like a tide of sorrow. Egyptians groaned where shields had failed, their wounds packed with dust and blood. Hittites dragged themselves from broken carts, crawling toward water, toward shade, toward anything that promised a few more breaths. Fires smoldered in collapsed tents. Supply carts, overturned in the chaos, spilled grain into the sand. Food mingled with ash and death. Ramesses still stood. His chariot was cracked, his armor scarred, his horses foaming and trembling. But Pharaoh had not broken. Around him, the Ammon division closed ranks, beaten yet unbent. They raised their voices in chants, a rough sound that carried more grit than glory. Men defying despair with sound alone. Across the plain, the Naaran allies pulled their wounded from the heaps, their arrival the wedge that had kept Egypt from annihilation. And what of Muwatalli? The Hittite king had unleashed the greatest chariot host the world had ever seen, and still Egypt had not fallen. He could claim that Kadesh had not been taken, that his city still stood behind its walls, its gates unbroken. Yet he had not crushed the Pharaoh. The storm of bronze had rolled and thundered, but it had not drowned Egypt. Both kings looked upon the field and found no victory, only exhaustion. In the days that followed, the truth was carved not only in memory, but in stone. Ramesses, returning to Egypt, sang of triumph. Reliefs upon temple walls showed him alone, driving back 1,000 Hittites. A living god in mortal flesh. Muwatalli, too, sent word to his people of victory. Egypt had not taken Kadesh. Egypt had been stopped. But the field itself told a different story. It spoke of thousands who would never march again, of horses buried in shallow graves, of dust still red when the next rain fell. It spoke of the cost of pride, of the weight of lies, of how war consumes glory, even as it promises it. From this furnace came something no battlefield had yielded before. Years later, when tempers cooled and the dead were long dust, the two empires bent not to war, but to parchment. Egypt and Hatti etched into clay and silver the first treaty the world would remember, a pact of peace sworn before gods to bind two powers weary of endless ruin. Legion, remember the Battle of Kadesh. Remember the largest chariot clash ever to shake the earth, the storm of bronze and blood that left no victor. Remember how kings dressed failure as triumph, and how from carnage was born the first treaty of men. Stand with me, warriors. Subscribe and join the Legion, for the Chronicles of fire and storm march ever onward. The night of battle never ends.